Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome Subboor Ahmad and Dr. Salman Butt. You're most welcome, gentlemen. Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Great to see you both. Usually we just have two people on the channel. This time it's three, so that's interesting. Now, you're both co-authors of a fascinating new book titled The Death of Neo-Darwinism. And I'll just put it on the screen so you can see what it looks like. Here we go. The new book, The Death of Neo-Darwinism. That's the cover, with kind of like a DNA motif with kind of flowers and roses on, published by Sapience Publishing. I will put a link in the description below so you can get hold of your copy, and I do recommend the book. But before we discuss it, let me introduce you both. Dr. Salman Butt completed his undergraduate studies in biochemistry and earned a PhD in chemical biology at Imperial College here in London, focusing on photosynthesis. His thesis, titled Technologies and Methodologies to Characterize Rubisco Function, explored methods to purify and quantify Rubisco, the most abundant enzyme using algae and plants. His published works include titles like Isolation and Kinetic Characterization of Hydrophobically Distinct Populations of Form 1 Rubisco. I have no idea what that means. And
rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
And osmosensitive changes in carbohydrate metabolism in response to cellulose biosynthesis inhibition. Equally, I have no idea what that means.
That one's a great read.
It's a very impressive. Very impressive. Anyway, beyond science, because you have a life beyond science, Salman is active in Islamic, social, spiritual, and political initiatives, currently serving as head of Islamic thought at Islam 21C, a major global Muslim platform. So an incredibly impressive CV. And equally impressive, anticipating the doctorate you will get doubtless one day soon, Subboor Ahmad is a writer and debater, actively engaged in discussions about new atheism. We met at Speaker's Corner yesterday, where he was displaying his awesome powers of rhetoric and argumentation there. He earned a master's degree in philosophy from Birkbeck College, University of London, with a particular interest in the philosophy of biology. I didn't know that was a thing, but it really is, philosophy of biology. His master's thesis explored methodological adaptionism and junk DNA, which will also be central to his forthcoming book. Throughout his career, Subboor has debated atheist apologists, including academics and online figures, addressing topics such as science, the existence of God, and Darwinism. He hosts a well-known academic podcast featuring a range of thinkers and is currently pursuing postgraduate studies in science and religion, focusing on theistic evolution. So, what inspired you both to write this book? Over to you.
Maybe I'll introduce it because I was writing the book, and in the process of writing, I was like, I need help. So that's when I rang Salman. that's where
I was inspired because Subboor told me to jump on board, and he had done most of the work already. So I thought, I'll take some credit.
So to give an introduction, the first thing I want to point out is we all are aware of the God delusion, the new atheism movement. The crux of the argument in the God delusion, in what's known as the central argument, is based upon Neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism is used as a justification for atheism, as a justification for the moral ideas. In fact, what you find in the God delusion is the very genesis of morals and ethics and these types of values that are espoused is simply due to natural selection working on random variations, which allows human beings to have a moral compass. So the worldview, whether it's a lack of belief in God or it's a belief in their particular moral perspective, it's all based on Neo-Darwinism. So Neo-Darwinism currently is the dominant view in biology, and Neo-Darwinism simply means post-Darwinism, what happened after Darwin. So this includes the incorporation of genetics, and that's why it's sometimes referred to as the modern synthesis. And Neo-Darwinism, let's just put it to the viewers in this particular way, it is the Aqidah, it is the belief, it is the very foundation of most educated atheists. This is their perspective. This is why we wanted to tackle the beast and take it by the horns. And where I employed Salman's expertise is my background's in the philosophy of biology, and I thought to myself, I need someone to fact check me. I need someone to make sure that the biology side is sufficiently covered, as in it's been proofread and academically edited. And also, I thought Salman's own PhD and his own work in the field was relevant to the book. So he sort of joined late, but that's how it came about.
Okay. I noticed, by the way, the book is subtitled, I didn't mention this, Dawkins versus Noble. So this is a great clash of the titans. But who is this guy, Dennis Noble? Because while everyone's familiar probably with Richard Dawkins, the great English atheist, well, I use the word great in a very loose sense. Why is their debate significant? What's going on there? What's the clash of titans there?
That's a brilliant question, Paul. So the reason why I put that subtitle is because this is the biggest conversation happening in biology today.
Wow.
If we look back at their debate in 2022, this debate captured the biological community. It's been translated. It's something that's been covered on TV. It's big news in the biological domain. And this particular debate is something that the laity is unaware of. So this is where we wanted to use the arguments of one Noble and on the other side of Neo-Darwinism, Richard Dawkins, in order to explain what's happening currently in biology. Now, I just want to take people back to who is Dennis Noble. I'm sure they know who Richard Dawkins is. Dennis Noble is a pioneer in systems biology. He worked on the function of the heart. He is one of the first to actually show a biological function on a computer, and this goes back to the 1960s. He developed what's known as the Noble model, named after him, in the 1960s. He's been working at the cutting edge of cancer research today. He's been a professor at Oxford University for many, many decades, and he is by training a physiologist, but then his contribution to evolution in the last 20 or so years, that's what's really come to the forefront. He was the PhD examiner of Richard Dawkins back in 1966. And alongside that, he is a fellow of the Royal Society. The Royal Society goes back to the 1700s, and it's the most prestigious and oldest scientific society in the world. So he's a fellow there. He set up a meeting in 2016, which was known as New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. This is Darwinists, Neo-Darwinists and their opponents, the third way evolutionists. And he's someone that's been publishing in Nature, in the Linnaean Society, with over 700 papers, scientific papers, research papers that he's published. So he's really great. Yeah.
But you mentioned a little detail there. He was Richard Dawkins' PhD supervisor, or originally examiner. So this is quite ironic, indeed. So you get the sense of the slightly more senior academic there. Yeah. Okay. So
just maybe tell you a little bit about their relationship. So they both started off as Neo-Darwinists. They both started off believing in that reductive ideology. We will break down what that is exactly shortly. Now, what happened is, as developments were taking place in biology and Noble sort of fell off the bandwagon, in the early years of the selfish gene, he actually hosted debates where he was debating on side of Richard Dawkins against opponents. Later on, he became the chair of the debate. So he was chairing the debate between Lynn Margulis, another pioneer in biology, and Richard Dawkins, and also Anthony Kenny, another philosopher. So long story short, he started off on the same side as Richard Dawkins, and over a few decades, he moved on to the other side, which is known as the third way of evolution. That's where these two giants go in different directions.
Very interesting. Now, my next question really is about asking you to clarify the difference between reductive and holistic biology. So presumably this is, Dawkins is more of a reductionist, I guess, and the other is more in favor of holistic understanding of biology. I really know nothing about this. So could you perhaps explain in ways that lay people like myself will understand, what is the difference between reductive and holistic biology?
Sure. I think I'll give that to Salman because his chapter in particular breaks that down.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so reductionism and holism, they go beyond biology. It's actually just like two ways of looking at any problem, really. Reductionism says you want to understand something by breaking it down into smaller and smaller parts. and then kind of until you understand the function and you understand a level where you understand, and then you build up the picture that way. Holism says look at something as a whole unit, as a whole system. And that's where the word systems comes. Systems engineering, systems biology comes in. Now, reductionism and holism, then a responsible, comprehensive way to look at biology is to take both into account. You need to obviously understand the parts of certain things, but you also need to understand why and how they were put together that way, right? So the problem comes in where, like people like Dawkins, they instead of using as a tool to understand something, it kind of gets carried away and it gets mixed up with scientism as a kind of from an ideological perspective, you know. And we'll probably talk about that in more detail, but just briefly reductionism is trying to break things down into smaller and smaller parts. And holism is basically looking at something as a whole, or as a system, or as a big network of moving metabolites and molecules and even organisms in a particular area or a field of crops or something like this. So reductionism, break down into smaller parts. Holism is looking at things as a whole.
But what you're saying sounds very reasonable. Just two different ways of looking at the same phenomena, but one reductionist, one more holistic. But I get the sense there's a real kind of clash between Dawkins and Noble. This is more than just a different way of looking at, a complementary way of looking at things. There seems to be something more fundamental at work here, doesn't there, than just a complementary way of looking at things? Is that, and if so, what is the essence of this clash?
So Dawkins, Dennis Noble, he talks about Neo-Darwinism as having all the hallmarks of a religion, of like a European religion. It has its dogmas, it has its heretics, it even has its notion of original sin. We're all born selfish, you know. Yeah. So the problem occurs when people become dogmatic about certain things, and as we mentioned in the book, Neo-Darwinism has 4 pillars. You know, Islam has 5 pillars. Neo-Darwinism has 4 pillars. Right. You know, and we can talk about those pillars. So that's where the issue really comes in. So once they develop dogmas and are unwilling to, they become paradigmatic almost, in that they begin to interpret things through those dogmas rather than allow new experiments, new evidence, new observations to fix or correct or change their dogmas. That's where the problem comes in. Hence, that's where it's kind of built up over several decades.
Interesting. So, Subboor, you approach this from a philosophical angle, naturally. Why is philosophy, particularly the philosophy of biology, relevant in this context?
That's a brilliant question. So, as we all know, scientists, what we call scientists, this is a relatively recent phenomena. Even the term, they used to be called natural philosophers. So even Darwin, Isaac Newton, and going all the way back to the Islamic era, they were called natural philosophers. And what happened over time is science broke off from philosophy. However, some of the foundational assumptions related to the philosophy of biology in particular were sort of left by the wayside. And what Dennis Noble does is he reintroduces these. And it starts off with him explaining when he was a schoolboy back in, I believe, the 50s. He gives the example of when he was at school, there was this whole sort of discussion about purpose, and purpose not basically existing. And it's just all an illusion, and it doesn't really exist. And he was kind of thinking as a schoolboy, well, when the cat, is running after the mice, and the mice are trying to just save themselves, isn't there a purpose of the cat, a purpose of the mice? Isn't there a purpose to these living systems? And later on, when he was at university, he started taking some philosophy classes alongside his biology classes, and he came across a philosopher who said to him, Mr. Noble, you should read Spinoza. And Spinoza, if we go back to the 1700s, he was the great opponent of Descartes. And Descartes was someone who fundamentally came up with a very reductive way of looking at life. So his idea, which Noble traces Dawkins back to and all these neo-Darwinists back to, is the idea that, well, if we knew all of the contents of the semen, we could predict the future organism's form and function and structure and behavior. So that was the beginning of this type of reductionism. And Spinoza was the great opponent of Descartes. And he argued, no, actually, you can't look at things from that particular perspective. So that's the influence of Spinoza got Noble to start thinking about causation. Right, started thinking about these types of things. So that led to his development of the idea of the one-eyed watchmaker. And I think this is an important analogy. So the blind watchmaker we're all aware of, 1980s, you have Richard Dawkins arguing that all you have is natural selection working on random mutations over time, and that leads to the creation of mind and body and morals and everything, right? And Dennis Noble's perspective is there is a one-eyed watchmaker from the perspective that agency and purpose does exist, and you do have a direct correlation between the environment and what's happening in the genome. So the way I like to introduce the topic is Noble takes it back to Aristotle's view of causality, right? And the nature of causality. So the example that Aristotle gives is that there's 4 types of causes. There is the efficient cause. So say this table in front of me, I am the efficient cause. I am the one, the carpenter making the table. The second cause is a material cause, the actual table itself. The third is the form. So the second cause is the wood. The third is the actual form, the actual design, the dimensions of the table, which makes it into a table. So we recognize it as a table. And the fourth cause is the formal cause. The final cause, and it's known as the purposive cause, which is what's the purpose of this particular table, in this case putting stuff on and having a live stream. So what Noble says is there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the neo-Darwinists where they say that genes, the whole selfish gene idea, genes are there to be replicators, and the vehicle, the organism, ourselves, we're just there to retain genes in a gene pool. So ultimately, according to Noble, Dawkins and other neo-Darwinists believe genes are the efficient cause here. And he says, no, genes are a cause, but like a template, like a form. They're not actually active causes. And the active cause, according to Noble, and this is where things are completely 180 in biology, is that the active cause is the organism itself. And that's where we bring in the 4 pillars and how Dawkins' idea, which in the debate, it's a really lively debate. I recommend everyone to watch it. They're going back and forth, and Dawkins is basically saying to him that no, genes are causal, genes are the primary agents, and Noble is saying no, it's the organism. That is the fundamental debate between these giants.
I just said one thing there, which is a rank heresy, this idea of purpose in nature, teleology. This is what Aristotle's idea, which was, I think, banished as a great forbidden thought. You can't talk about meaning and purpose in the universe. That's all banished. And so but that is Aristotle's original idea. But you're saying that Noble is reintroducing a kind of teleology into biology, which, yes. So I can see why it is so controversial to many people.
Yeah. So one of the things that Noble says, which I find quite funny, is that he said, winning a Nobel Prize doesn't mean you're going to be listened to. So he takes it back to Barbara McClintock. Yes. In 1983, she won the Nobel Prize for discovering a process that for many decades wasn't allowed to be mainstream science. And she discovered this process back in the 30s. And the process that she discovered was in corn, in maize corn, or what we call Indian corn. And what she discovered is that the external pressure caused the corn in the next generation to change either its texture, its length, its number of seeds, or whatever it is. Yes, that's right. And what she basically noticed is there's something strange going on here. It's not a case where you have random changes in the corn, and then one of them is naturally selected to be best suited. Rather, there's an active causation within the system itself. So there's something from the outside. Now, her student, James Shapiro, in the 1990s actually discovered what that was. So McClintock knew there was a process, knew that something is going on, and he's the one who actually broke it down to what he calls natural genetic engineering, which in very simple terms is where you have the external environment intelligently causing the genome to fluctuate, to mutate, to rapidly mutate in certain places or rearrange, right? And what you basically get is you get a whole new, I mean, a good way of putting it actually is shelves. There's two different processes I mentioned and I mixed them up. So let me just put it in simpler terms. The shelves behind me, if you imagine these shelves, each one of them is a gene, right? That shelf is a gene, that shelf is a gene, that shelf is a gene. So what you would have is that the external environment would cause an epigenetic change. So certain genes would be switched on, certain genes would be switched off, right? And that would cause the next generation to have an adaptive response, okay? So that's the process that McClintock discovered and Shapiro went into more detail. Now, the other process, somatic hypermutation, I think Salman will discuss that later.
For the second, I understand from a lecture I saw on YouTube with Noble that she was actually told that she was wrong in this belief, and she stopped publishing for years because of this. I mean, she basically told, you're wrong. This is completely baloney. And then in her 80s, I think she was 82, she got awarded a Nobel Prize in science for this discovery. It was an extraordinary human story of a woman who had been, basically, cast out from respectable discourse, finally being acknowledged by that very community with the highest science prize in the world. And in her 80s, and she gave apparently a great speech. But it's an extraordinary human story. But sorry to interrupt. I just wanted people to know that they actually shut her up. She felt so demoralized. She actually stopped publishing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to add something. I'm really happy you mentioned this, Paul. And I'm going to get Salman to break down the implications of this in a little while. And I think he'll be able to do a better job than what I'm doing now in terms of the details. But one of the things I found really interesting is that she, in terms of the implications of her idea of genome reorganization, she was basically putting a dagger in the heart of neo-Darwinism. She was basically saying it is not random mutations and natural selection, it is genome reorganization. Now, I love an example that Dennis Noble gives of this, right? The example that he gives of this is brilliant. And the example is, you have a child with Lego pieces, small bricks, and you give that child small Lego pieces and you tell them, build a bridge, build a car, build a house, whatever. A second child, you give them bricks, but you also give them pre-made arches, beams, columns, walls, tunnels, whatever it is. And then you put on a timer and you tell them both to build a house. Who's going to build it faster? It's going to be the child with the prefabricated parts rather than the child with just the bricks alone. So what Noble does is, in the debate with Dawkins, he highlights a paper, a landmark paper, one of the most important papers in the last 50 to 60 years. And that is the sequencing of the human genome in 2001. And what he does is he shows, using that paper, that Shapiro's argument is that this particular, they did many different things. They covered many different organisms, from yeast to worm to flies to humans, like, all these organisms. And what they discovered is the history of life, or over millions of years, has not been point mutations, random mutations accumulating. It's actually the genome being restructured, entire domains being shifted from one location to another, just like the child with the Lego pieces, with the prefabricated Lego pieces. And this was a point, and this is where I want Salman to come in, where Dawkins was left floored. He wasn't aware of the study. He couldn't respond to the study.
Oh, really? Didn't
Then
know.
2 years later, he, after the debate, and he was very confused at that moment, he promised to write a book, write a chapter in which he was going to address Noble, which was his book that came out a few months ago, The Genetic Book of the Dead. And again, in that book, he couldn't address the point about genome reorganization. This is according to Perry Marshall, who's one of the collaborators alongside Shapiro and Noble and others within the third way of evolution. According to him, the discovery of this process makes McClintock more important than Darwin.
Mm-hmm.
So this is some really heavy stuff. So Salman, I'll give it to you in case I missed anything in terms of genome reorganization.
I mean, maybe it's good to talk about now the actual 4 pillars of neo-Darwinism.
Yeah.
Right. Like what are the core foundational kind of aqidah of neo-Darwinism? So number one, for example, as you alluded to here, is something called the Weizmann barrier. So Weizmann was a chap who did these experiments, cutting the tails of mice to see would this taillessness be inherited in future generations, which obviously no. I mean, Jewish and Muslim men have been doing something similar for thousands of years, but he was basically trying to get at Lamarck. Okay, forgot his name. What first name?
John Baptiste
Lamarck.
Yeah. The much vilified.
yeah. So the Lamarck basically said that certain characteristics and functions were that are acquired in the lifetime of an organism could be inherited by later generations, right? But neo-Darwinism, Darwin actually agreed with him, but neo-Darwinism has a dogma, a pillar of faith that says no. There's a strict separation between the normal cells of the body and the DNA therein, and the germline. So the cells, the DNA that gets passed on to future generations from either the testes or the ovaries, right? So if something were to happen to an organism in its function, in its environment, in its structure of certain things, that characteristic, that trait doesn't get inherited into future generations. Okay, that's called the Weizmann barrier. The second pillar is of neo-Darwinism is what we call a central dogma. DNA makes RNA makes protein. Okay, so your DNA basically is the book of life. It's the code. It's the instruction manual. It's the thing. It's the tiniest cog. If we look at from the reductionist kind of worldview, where you're trying to describe something like a watch or something, using going to tinier and tinier cogs, DNA is the fundamental blueprint, and causation kind of emanates from there. Okay, your DNA basically causes everything in your body. That's the second, or that's another pillar of, I don't know if it's important, the order is not that important, but that's another pillar of faith for neo-Darwinism. A third one is, as a result of that, us as organisms, we are just kind of passive vessels carrying around, these lumbering robots kind of carrying around genes. And this is what led to the kind of the famous selfish gene hypothesis, right? Like a cool story that genes are using us just to replicate, just to serve themselves, just to kind of spread throughout different generations and so forth. So the genes are the real thing, and our bodies, our organisms, everything is just there to house and then protect and replicate genes. And the fourth pillar of neo-Darwinism is any change that happens from one generation to the next, so i.e. evolution, it's solely the result of random mutations and then natural selection. So random mutations during the replication of genes from one cell to the next, okay? And then if there must be some kind of trait that emanates thereafter. So you maybe, if you're a bird, you get a sharper beak, and then that beak allows you to, get get more juicy insects or whatever, or it makes you more
More
you know,
attractive to the
more
lady.
attractive to the lady, the ladybirds, not ladybirds, but and some kind of selection, some kind of adaptation, some kind of advantage, survival of the fittest, that kind of stuff. And so the pillar of faith here for Neo-Darwinists is that process is a random one. It's blind.
Yeah.
It's at the mercy of just random forces of the universe. And so each one of these pillars, and this is what the book is about, this is what Dennis Noble his work is about, each one of these pillars, one by one, has been basically proven false, through decades. And we've known about this for decades, as in the scientific community. But like what Subboor mentioned about Barbara McClintock, because if your research is kind of getting towards some kind of kufr against one of these pillars, some kind of heresy, some kind of blasphemy against these pillars, in her case the random error pillar, then that's when you get silence. That's when you get even Paul Dennis Noble himself. He started publishing these risky heretical kind of beliefs only in the last 20 years or so, when he actually retired from being the guy's like 100 years old, mashallah. Like I didn't, but when he retired from being the leader of an active research lab, because he had people's salaries to worry about. Someone could be a martyr himself, but he's got an entire team. If he gets kind of blacklisted and he doesn't get any grants and stuff, that's the salaries of lots of people. Yeah. So once he retired from that and he began lecturing and writing more on these risky blasphemous, quote unquote blasphemous topics to Neo-Darwinists, that's when he was allowed the freedom to do that. And he's been publishing a lot, and he's been publishing under Subboor, correct us if I'm wrong. He's been published by good academic university presses and publishing houses.
He's not been reputable. He's been published by a reputable university.
Yes,
he's not been the worst. So just saying, there's one thing I find very interesting: this idea of foresight, because the one model is sort of a bottom-up model where you have DNA and the rest of the organism is just kind of serving the DNA's need to reproduce itself and so on. It's a very kind of demeaning reductionist view of life or humanity. But this idea of a systems approach seems to contain within it an element of foresight. So there's a sense of the system has a sense of what its purpose is. So it can foresee its role in its environment. And this is a revolutionary different paradigm, isn't it, from the classical Neo-Darwinism thing? As you're saying, it's not just a tinkering with science. This is a whole new way of looking at, and it reminds me of Professor John Polkinghorne a little bit, actually. He was the mathematical physicist at Cambridge who actually resigned his post as professor there to become an Anglican priest. And he wrote lots of books on Christianity and science. When I was a Christian, I was very interested in what he had to say. But he also had a similar approach, of sort of top-down approach, he called it. So where you actually looked at a holistic system rather than reducing it to some bits and pieces in a very fundamental way. So, and he was a physicist saying that. So I thought that was very.
Yeah. I mean, Dennis Noble, he writes quite extensively on this. When part of systems biology, he likens it to the move from Copernican and Galilean kind of heliocentric and geocentric views of the universe, like the sun being the center of the universe, and then the earth being the center of the universe. He likens that to the shift in Einsteinian kind of in general relativity, where actually you can't really say there's a center of the universe. Everything is there's no privileged part, there's no privileged center of the universe. You look at things relative to something else. So, relative to us, Neptune is moving this way, and relative to us and the sun, these types of things. So he likens it to that, in that there's no privileged scale of causality, of causation, okay? Or there's no privileged scale. So the reductionists will say the smaller and smaller you get until you can understand and characterize something, That's the scale we're going to look at, and then build up thereafter. It's actually quite an arrogant and egotistical kind of way to look at things, and that, you know, once I understand something, that's the privilege, you know, the scale at which I understand something, that's the privilege scale. That's something special at that scale. Then I'm going to build up thereafter. You know, the universe, the truth is under no obligation to make sense to you. Whether or not it makes sense to you is a function of your own, you know, background, your cultural norms, your background knowledge.
But you mentioned causality there. I mean, what paradigm shift does biology undergo regarding causality, according to Noble's perspective? What's going on here?
So higher levels can exercise causal pressure on lower, quote unquote, lower levels, smaller levels. Mm-hmm. So an example is this genome reorganization. Example is during COVID, all of us, when a particle of COVID-19 entered into our bloodstream or our, you know, respiratory system, there were certain cells in our bodies that actually told their genomes, hey, mutate like hell in this part of your DNA and this part of your genes, so that you can create loads of different mutations, but just in this part. Like to use a Lego example, you're telling that kid, you know, change the color or experiment with different shapes of the bridge. Let's keep the pillars the same, but this, you know, I want different styles of bridge at the top. So he's, you know, they're mutating like crazy in this part. So the cell is the highest, the higher scale. Right. It's telling the lower scale, okay, mutate in these parts. And obviously that's what happens when we encounter a foreign pathogen an antigen in our bodies. You know, you make a whole repertoire of different antibodies, immunoglobulins to attack different parasite, different pathogens and stuff like that enter the bloodstream or the respiratory system, whatever. Another example is during my research, I found that, so I worked on one enzyme. Okay, it was an amazing enzyme. It's probably the best enzyme. I sound a bit like Trump now. It's amazing. It's great.
There's a hierarchy of enzymes. Is there? Yours is the best, the bestest enzyme ever. Yours isn't. Yeah. It is the bestest.
Yeah. Your enzyme's not that good, but mine does better than yours. But I mean, I used to for a good few months, I used to grab a cabbage on the way into the lab from the Waitrose next to the station, and I just used to spend a few hours purifying the enzyme there, and I would find that when trying to purify something, just one enzyme, you always found it existing in heavier or as heavier than you would expect, kind of multi-enzyme molecules. And this is an example of, again, the cell or higher levels of organized biological organization exercising pressure, exercising causality on lower levels in terms of atoms and molecules. Okay, so what reductionism kind of taught us, or you know, maybe even what we teach a younger science student, we give the impression that cells are like these bags of water with stuff sloshing around in there, and then just reactions happen, right? But when you look into the cell, you know, in more and more detail, you don't. It's not just machines. It's not like a machine, because machinery, the word machine would give you the impression of that, you know, tiny and tinier cogs. No, it's like cities. You know, cells have, you know, transportation networks. They have, you know, they have garbage collectors. They have, you know, information systems. They have immigration kind of you know, system to detect anything that shouldn't be there. So cells are highly organized, like cities, right? And these high levels of organization, they actually and the phrase is harness randomness. They harness stochasticity. Stochasticity is just a fancy name for randomness, where you have you know, different probabilities of you know, mathematically, like just randomness. Okay, they harness stochastics, they harness randomness, and make randomness occur where they want it to occur. So why am I saying this? So enzymes, for example, an enzyme is something in the cell makes the cell, the organism tells the DNA to make me this enzyme, that I want to make this enzyme to catalyze a reaction. Okay, so just catalyze, it just makes two things react without being used up itself. That's what an enzyme does. So for reactions like this, not just Rubisco, but in biology, you have lots of reaction pathways and cycles, where one enzyme does one reaction and the product of that reaction goes to another enzyme, and then it does something else, and then it goes to a third enzyme and a fourth enzyme. Instead of just all those reactants and all those molecules and atoms sloshing around with the enzymes, just bumping into, randomly wandering into the active site of the next enzyme, what we find is the cell actually puts many of these enzymes together, into multi-enzyme complexes. So when so it acts almost like a giant funnel. So a carbon dioxide molecule comes into the active site of Rubisco, it catalyzes a reaction, and the product of that reaction is fed directly into the next enzyme along, right? So instead of kind of relying on the random Brownian motion of kind of diffusing molecules bumping about, it's actually harnessing stochasticity, harnessing randomness, and channeling it into in an organized fashion. And that's one of the definitions, actually, Dennis Noble in one of his books, that's one of the definitions almost of life itself, the harnessing of stochasticity, the harnessing of randomness. So this is an example of higher level organization exercising causation on lower level organization. Another example is what Dennis Noble worked on himself, the heartbeat, the heart beat, program he wrote even in a kind of computer model, that the heartbeat doesn't emerge from DNA, right? The heart cell uses DNA obviously to make some protein. So it's true that DNA does make RNA and RNA does make protein, but it's driven by the cell. The cell needs certain things to, I won't go into the details, but it needs certain proteins to, exist in the membrane, in the membrane of the cells. Again, and the membrane, by the way, isn't coded for in the DNA as well. It's again something that's acquired from a high level organization. And those proteins that the cell, that the organization, the organism requests from the DNA and gets the DNA to create for it, they work together. And once you get a few quote unquote ingredients together, the heartbeat rhythm emerges. This is an example of emergent behavior, right? So it's not something that's deterministic. It's not something that's kind of caused from a lower level. But when you have when the heart cell has these ion channels and so forth, and you have certain negatively charged ions outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. One opens and it allows for example, a negatively charged ion to come in. That changes the potential of the cell, becomes negative inside, and that causes another thing to deform. And then when that protein deforms, it allows another molecule out, and it happens to happen almost around once per second. That's the heartbeat emerges from that process, that purposivity.
But what strikes me as a layman in all of this is that this strongly, powerfully suggests design, purpose. There are clearly theological and metaphysical implications for this. It is so sophisticated and engineered. This is clearly not a meaningless, random set of processes. These are highly complex, engineered phenomena you're describing. Thus, behind it always, it seems very natural. Maybe it's the fitra speaking, that behind this is an intelligence of some kind. Now, we don't have to call it God, we can call it anything we want, but it does have metaphysical implications, does it not? I mean, Noble himself, does he, because you say he did philosophy at university and he does discuss these things, does he bring in theology or metaphysics?
No,
or
he doesn't. And I really love that you introduced that segue in, because it's really important. We need to now speak about the implication. We can go all day until the cows come home about holism and the power of looking at the biological system from this perspective, but it's really about what is the metaphysics here. Now, he set the third way of evolution alongside James Shapiro and Scott Turner and others, and the reason it's called the third way is because they believe Neo-Darwinism is insufficient. So that's the first way, and it's gone. The second way, they say, is intelligent design or creationism, and they say that is not science because it's not naturalistic. It introduces an arbitrary supernatural force in nature. So they reject a creationism or intelligent design. And Dennis Noble himself is not religious in any sense. So it's not the second way. So the third way of evolution, the way Perry Marshall explains it, and he's one of the collaborators in the project, is Neo-Darwinists underestimate nature, and creationists and intelligent design proponents underestimate God.
So how do they underestimate? So I get the first part. What's the second part? How do creationists underestimate God?
From the perspective that they limit what God could have done or what is possible. So Perry Marshall himself, for example, is a theist. Dennis Noble is not, right? He's not, but they both are open to the idea that whatever metaphysics you want to build upon, the physics, the biology, that's entirely up to you. So there's a really famous interview in which Dennis Noble, it's actually a documentary where he talks about boiling water being thrown at him because of these things, and people saying you're introducing God, and there was this pressure in biology for him to basically keep quiet. And one of the causes of that, according to Noble, is that people thought we're introducing God, but we're not introducing God. But clearly there is a metaphysics there. And my friend Qasser Ahmad Raja, he interviewed Dennis Noble, and it's the only interview I've seen where Dennis Noble is really pushed on the idea of God. Usually it's just the physics and the biology of it. And Dennis Noble says, look, well, whatever you build on that, that's entirely up to you. That's your own philosophy, your own metaphysics. I'm just here to basically do the science. And one of his rebuttals to the neo-Darwinists who say you challenging reductionism is basically reintroducing God, he says, look, I'm here to do science. Whether someone builds something on this for their own metaphysics, that's not something you can hold me accountable for.
But Subboor, I hear what you're saying. I guess I kind of understand it, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's not that you can build on what he's saying if you want, kind of like an arbitrary thing. I'm suggesting the very nature of nature, the way you're describing it, the complexity, the engineering, and the purposefulness, the system talk that you both have given suggests a transcendent mind. It's not an add-on. It is emerging as a metaphysics that emerged naturally from it. And of course, that fits in very nicely what the Quran says actually about nature, the universe being a sign of God's existence, of His majesty and power and intelligence and purpose and beneficence and providence. I mean, it just seems such a natural step to take. It's not like you're just adding it on. It flows from it. It seems to me.
So this is where, and again, I'm filling in the gaps because Noble doesn't point these things out explicitly, but it is implicitly there on the third way of evolution. They are committed to naturalism. And naturalism is a philosophical idea which ultimately you can never allow God, angels, anything metaphysical, anything non-material into your toolbox of looking at the world. So the way that I've seen, I mean, I recently interviewed one of his collaborators, Scott Turner, and Scott Turner says design is real, but it's designed by nature itself. So, the third way evolutionists, they are, I mean, the way they like to see it is we are committed to naturalism, but we reject reductionism and we reject neo-Darwinism. Now, the rebuttal to them from the neo-Darwinists is, well, you kind of are pandering to the creationists. And then they explicitly say, no, we're not creationists. And they explicitly say, we don't support intelligent design. So it's like a no man's land. That's what Scott Turner recently said to me during an interview. He said it's a no man's land. It's somewhere between, this type of atheistic way of looking at the world and this other, domain.
Paul, I have a different a view here. And I discussed it with the Subboor as well, in that I think when it comes to atheism, it doesn't have a foot in the door in either of these camps when it comes to actually what the science or what one would assume to be, correct or close to the truth when it comes to the mechanics of, how biological systems and organisms work. Because if you think about it, neo-Darwinism requires an atheist to hold far more absurd assumptions to sustain his or her atheism. If you believe that DNA is the fundamental driver, it contains information, it's self-replicating, it's able to control all of these functions, able to hold your body, as captive to its desires, and it just came out of nothing. So either way, I think mixing atheism. I say atheism is sociological, right? Atheism, it's about human, culture and norms and rejection of the church and all types of things. Mixing it with biology is bound to lead to absurdities, and if they're free to believe what they want to believe. But I think it's harder for an honest atheist to come to terms with believing in neo-Darwinism as it is when it comes to anything else, because what they actually believe about genes and DNA and so forth is almost giving it kind of divine qualities anyway.
Exactly.
Right. And it doesn't have a foot in the door. Once you you take the universe for granted, you take the laws of physics for granted, you take the fact that there are stochastic, quote unquote random processes that happen based on natural laws and so forth. You could take either approach. But what systems biology does do, though, what third way does do, is it resonates with your fitra, because everything about the deen has a holistic element to it, right? It's human beings are not kind of lumbering robots just being with no free will. That's another issue that they have to come to grips with. That all of your desires, everything, all your actions are emanating from your genes. No, that's not the case. We understand this, and we would just take it one level beyond, and add that our holism, our system, includes things like the hereafter, includes things like the unseen, the things that we and their reluctance to kind of venture anywhere near there is again a sociological thing. It's about one of the pillars of secularism as it emerged in Europe is this notion of disenchantment, right? That we don't want to believe in fairies and sprites and these types of things. So in their reaction of that, they've gone towards kind of a hardcore naturalism, which itself cannot be internally justified. I regard naturalism or physicalism, I explain it sometimes as we only believe what that which exists is that which we can currently observe. When you have that word currently, right, it kind of puts things into perspective that, wait a second, this is more about responsible science versus dogma, right? And new atheists, those that have hijacked, kind of tried to hijack biology in the last century, they they're just using it to kind of paste over problems with their nafs, problems with ego, because what does reductionism do? It's very difficult to not to just say, I don't know how something works when at this level. Let me look at it, or I just don't know. You begin to break it down to smaller and smaller problems until you understand something. It's actually irresistible. It requires some level of character and level of humility to say I don't know. And even if I do understand it at this lower level, these mechanics, I'm not going to assume that is what is driving everything else above it. It requires a level of humility, and it requires a level of intellectual humility. And that's something that they don't tend to work on. They don't tend to work on their nafs. They don't tend to work on their, character. And those that do are people, I believe, like those who are, welcome with opening arms this paradigm shift in biology, because they're not dogmatic about science. They love the fact that they could be proven wrong, and they love the fact that someone cares about their work enough to study it, read it, experiment, and try to prove it wrong in good faith, right? Because they recognize that they're all searching for a better and better story. And I use the word story important, on purpose, because that's what responsible science is trying to tell. We tell students, we tell children in schools, that in science classes, that certain what I call kind of ethical lies, right? We give them models, we give them metaphors, like like atoms are these little balls with electrons whizzing about like this, and this many orbitals and that many shells, and we tell them that cells are these bags of molecules slushing around. We know that that's probably not the case, right? But we should be honest enough and responsible when communicating science that, look, we're just giving you these models to get across a basic understanding. This is the story we have so far. Later on, you might learn in university, or in college or university, you might learn some more nuances. And this model I'm showing you now is going to be tweaked, and it might even be challenged. Okay, but don't take these models, don't take these now understandings, now explanations, these current explanations as dogma. And that's what the neo-Darwinists, in terms of the new atheists that have hijacked it, have done.
Yeah. I really love what you said there, Salman, because it reminded me of a conversation I had with James Shapiro, who is the natural successor of McClintock. And that's exactly the terminology he used. He said we need to be careful of the now explanations, as McClintock put it, because we can have future explanations which will totally challenge our paradigms. In fact, one of his papers that he published was, we now know of processes that were previously thought to be impossible, right? Impossible. Also, going back to this idea of purpose, one of the things that he's credited with is really pushing the idea, and he's published, in fact, one of his papers is called this, all cells are cognitive, this idea that cognition comes back in, and he defines cognition as decisions based upon wisdom, right? And straight away that has teleological inferences. However, he doesn't subscribe to that. He actually is critical of intelligent design. I've interviewed him about 5 times now, and he knows I'm I believe in God, I believe in intelligent design. Yet his way of dealing with believers is totally different, because he understands ultimately the science can be used to make inferences of a theistic or atheistic nature. Obviously, we'd say it definitely leads this way. Others would disagree. But one thing I do like about the third way evolutionists is that they're willing to acknowledge that there are gaps. There are things we don't know. There are things to be discovered. There's a lot of, when I interview Shapiro, Scott Turner, and other people with a similar sort of broad mindset when it comes to biology, it's the excitement of the future decades. It's the stuff we don't know. It's the stuff that, the new research areas for students. I mean, one of the things that we haven't spoken about, but I think is really important, is junk DNA. This is what I did my thesis on, and this is probably one of the craziest stories in genetics. We had this idea that most of the genome is junk. Philip Kitcher, the philosopher of science, said God needs to go back to school, right? Based upon the fact that junk DNA is there. Dawkins uses junk DNA as an argument, and it was prevalent everywhere. And in 2012, the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, they published a study. This was a study with, all these top scientists across the world. They discovered most of the genome is not junk. And funnily enough, James Shapiro, for a very long time, was saying it's not junk. For decades, we neglected the studies to discover the functions of the genome because we presumed the neo-Darwinian way of thinking of it's just junk. There's no point looking for it. I've actually published my thesis on my website, and inshallah I'm going to make it into a book in the future. But I actually reference studies going back to the 80s and 90s, and scientists, biologists are discouraging others from looking into functions for these things. Now, Shapiro and others, they believe, no, there is functionality because they saw the genome not as a self-replicator. They saw it as a database, a template in which you can have, reorganization, natural genetic engineering, you can have somatic hypermutation, you can have all these different classes of processes taking place. So from their perspective, it was not junk. Now, what we did discover is that not only is it not junk, a lot of that information is not only functional, it's an epistemic treasure trove, and it will help in terms of cancer, diabetes, a whole array of diseases. And this, previously categorized as junk, actually facilitated the expression. You actually had the organism having the ability to switch genes on and off. And that entire story that this is junk was based upon reductive biology, because holistic biology would say, well, this is all tools that the cell can use. So one of the things that we've discovered, and this is what Dennis Noble published last year in Nature. Nature is the most prestigious journal in the world, right? And I want everyone to look up this article. And what he basically argued is that we now know that genes are not the blueprint for life. They're not the blueprint for life, because because he also likes to use computer science language, you have conditional logic, right? You have the if, then that, and or else. All of that conditional logic is not in the genome. It's actually in the cell membrane, and the cell membrane is not coded for in the genome. All of that is inherited in the next generation. So inheritance is more than just the genome. You inherit the entire cellular structure, which is why there's a really funny interaction between Dawkins and Noble. And Dawkins says to him, look, Noble, I could take your DNA and I could engrave it in granite and leave it for 10,000 years, the AT, C, and G, and all of that. I could leave it for 10,000 years, and then I could put it into a sequencing machine and I'll recreate a Dennis Noble. And Noble says, no, you can't. You can't do that because you need an egg cell. And according to him, you need not just any egg cell, you need my mother's egg cell from 1936, because her life experiences left epigenetic markings which will make certain parts of the genome express. So to recreate me, you need the whole cell and my mother's cell, and therefore you can't just break it down. It's a really funny example, because Dawkins was actually really confused. And if you watch the debate, you find that the crowd is laughing because he'd not really heard this before. That, look, it's not just about genes being self-replicators and genes being causal and controlling the organism, like with the remote control, and the genome is isolated from the body. As McClintock said, the genome is a highly sensitive organ of the cell. It's a total 180, right? So that's what we really need to look at. I mean, this revolution that we're talking about in biology, the biggest conversation between Dennis Noble and Richard Dawkins, this is nothing short of the Einsteinian revolution from Newtonian physics.
Gosh, indeed, that's perhaps we could draw to a conclusion now. I just want to show people again the book. Here we go. This is the book we're talking about, The Death of Neo-Darwinism, Dawkins versus Noble, by our two esteemed guests here, published by Sapiens Institute, or Sapiens Publishing, as it's called. Link is in the description below. Do get hold of a copy. It's easy to get hold of. How many pages does the book have?
I don't recall.
Okay.
Not that many.
Not that many.
You don't learn it for free. You could buy it on.
It's the quality, not the quantity. But yeah.
I would like to highly recommend Dance to the Tune of Life. This is actually Dennis Noble's book, published by Cambridge, and this is the very book which Noble and Dawkins were debating about, because the very beginning of this book, you have the argument essentially for the one-eyed watchmaker rather than the blind watchmaker, which Dawkins took an exception to, and that is the discussion. It's all there. So our book, what we tried to do is we tried to take the latest, the latest book of Dennis Noble and Ray Noble is actually Understanding Living Systems, published in 2023, and Richard Dawkins wrote a reply to Noble's claims in the debate and in this book in 2024, the Genetic Book of the Dead. So our book is for the laity, and it's basically summarizing their debate, the peer-reviewed papers, everything, for someone to, get their foot into this area.
And you can also watch this video, which by the same title as the author's Dennis Noble. You can see apparently he's 100 years old, according to Subboor.
He's in his 80s.
Oh, he's much younger than that then. I have watched this video, and I must say I understood about 3% of it, which I think is quite good, actually, for complete ignoramus. So it's very useful talking to Salman and Subboor today to clarify exactly what he's talking about. But he's extremely eloquent and articulate, and has a great command of English and a great sense of humor. So he's actually quite interesting to watch, actually. And this was recorded 8 years ago, though, but it's still apparently, according to YouTube anyway. So it talks about his latest book, The Dance to the Tune of Life, which you've just mentioned. So you can watch that as well. Well, perhaps we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Salman and Subboor, soon to be Dr. Subboor, I'm sure. Inshallah, do read the book, do watch the video, do get up to speed, and this advice to myself as much as anyone else. But thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time, your expertise, and explaining an extraordinary world of science, which I didn't know anything about until recently. So thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.